We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Doomberg, head writer for the Doomberg Team and creator of the Doomberg Substack. Doomberg, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
Tom, anytime I see an invitation from you, I know there's something going wrong in the world. So always happy to be back with you, but I must admit, probably mixed emotions.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. You know, coincidentally, we've had some excellent timing on some of our interviews for, small events through the world. But I directly reached out to you this week to get your thoughts on what is happening, in a very, what could be considered a very consequential week. Obviously, literally a week ago, we're recording this on Friday morning, what would it be? 20th? Yeah, June 20th. And there's so much that has happened in this week. We saw Israel strike Iran initially. We've seen this escalation of the conflicts, and I want to really talk through this type of analysis with you because you guys have such an excellent way of thinking through and understanding incentives, but thinking through all of these different conflicts and different scenarios in the world. And I always appreciate your guys' analysis on this. So what do you think is, let's say, most important to consider in the calculus right now within this particular conflict of Iran versus Israel?
Yeah, I think the headline is that we believe, and we wrote last October, and we followed up earlier this week, much to the chagrin of perhaps some of our paying subscribers. Israel has wildly underestimated Iran's capabilities. We fear that Trump is about to fall into the same trap. As you know, we are unabashedly anti-war, and wars are much, much easier to start than to finish, and much easier to start than to lose. And Israel is a very small country surrounded by neighbors that don't like it. Totally understandable that it would have a bit of a trigger finger, I guess, especially in the aftermath of October 7th. So, not to minimize the existential threat that perhaps some in Israel felt that it faced, especially in in a world where Iran does actually get nuclear weapons. But to those of us that don't have a direct, emotional attachment to the conflict on either side, and believe me, there is no conflict that triggers a higher degree of emotion than Israel, Palestine, Israel, Iran. It didn't seem like the wisest thing for Israel to do. We predicted back in October of 2024 that they wouldn't. We were wrong. And anytime we're wrong, obviously it's disappointing, but mostly we treat it as a learning opportunity. And we wanted to look back at why we predicted that Israel would not attack Iran, and then see which of our sort of four axioms that led us to that conclusion was incorrect. And it's looking like Israel assumed it could deal a devastating early knockout blow. This was a roll of the dice, not to be taken lightly, and nothing about this is to be taken lightly, of course. But with each day, as we're seeing today, by the way, despite severe censorship and locking down of reporters and so on in both countries, we're seeing leaking into Twitter and Telegram footage of what looked like targeted Iranian strikes getting through the once vaunted Israeli missile defense system. And the longer this goes on, the more dire it gets for Israel, and the more pressure will grow on Trump to join the war. But it's not even clear to us that the U.S. joining the war is going to be all that decisive. And just as we're talking, I see headlines crossing the wire that Putin is saying that he fears the world is walking towards World War III and that Iran and Russia are fighting the same forces. We would argue that the new front in the Middle East is just the second major escalation of World War III, which began with the Russia-Ukraine war. And if you read the propaganda in Russia and China and and throughout the Middle East. And we would strongly encourage people to not just read the Canadian press for you or the US press for us or the Western European press. Read everybody's press and you'll get a much better sense of what's actually going on. To the Russians and the Chinese, this is just a new front in the Third World War, and they will treat it accordingly. And we find it very difficult to believe that Israel, a relatively small country with 1/10 of the population of Iran, can win a war of attrition against Iran, backstopped by Russia and China, at a time when the US is running short on anti-missile armaments, can barely supply Ukraine, and will reprioritize away from Ukraine to Israel. And so as the days go by, Netanyahu's decision to go to war a week ago looks riskier and riskier. And the one thing I would leave you with on this answer is that it's just a very sad situation. It's bewildering that here we are, yet another war. You know, when Trump ran on being a peace candidate, his base is fracturing. You could just see it on Twitter. He has a very monumental decision to make, and I'm afraid there's no good answers for him at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've touched on so many different pieces of what I wanted to talk to you about today, and we'll dig into all of them. But you know, it kind of strikes me of let's say the similarity of the attacks between Ukraine and Russia, or Ukraine on Russia a couple of weeks ago here, going into peace talks, as well as going into, making a deal with Iran and Israel striking Iran, kind of going into that. What do you make of that similarity where the countries launch a massive offensive going into some type of, hopeful deal?
I think it makes it almost impossible to negotiate in good faith, right? I mean, both attacks you're mentioning the attack on the Russian nuclear strategic bomber fleet, mm-hmm. which is almost unthinkable to say, and the decapitation strike that the Mossad tried to execute against Iran were extraordinarily similar. A lot of echoes, right, between those two assaults. Mm-hmm. A lot of very dangerous precedents being set, by the way. Decapitation strikes are kind of like not legal, and almost always backfire. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, Trump was the victim of at least 2 assassination attempts that we know of. So who knows? But here's some conclusions. Like, the United Nations is meaningless. I don't know why it still exists. The Security Council is ignored. Their proclamations are irrelevant. The International War Crimes Tribunal should just shut down. It is wild, wild west, and that's not good. And we have international law means nothing. There was a mechanism by which Israel's objections about Iran's nuclear weapons development was meant to be handled. That has been completely ignored. Trump flippantly saying, I will decide in 2 weeks whether to go to war with Iran. I thought Congress declared war. Maybe I'm naive. But to the broader point, there's a faction in DC that wants to go to war. That wants to go to war with Russia, wants to go with Iran, wants to go to war with China, never saw a war they didn't like. It's real. To deny it is naive. And Trump is either about to be swallowed up by them and sink his presidency, or was one of them all along and deceived his voters. And neither of those two things is pretty palatable. We spent the week, as you know, we live in flyover country. We've talked to people who voted for Trump. We know many of them. And it's like 90-10, wildly opposed to this. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to find somebody who thinks this is a good idea in Trump's base.
Well, I even saw a poll on Twitter that said the exact same thing, and it's obviously not all Republicans that would have answered that.
Trump ran as end of wars, and he was just in Saudi Arabia talking about no more regime change wars. And now we've gone from Israel has overrun Iran in the first few hours of the war to we need to nuke Iran because that's the only way to stop Iran from getting it. Like, it's been less than a week. What's going on? Mm-hmm. It's crazy. And look, Trump is spending an enormous amount of political capital right now. And by the way, his enemies on the left and the right, in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, probably pretty happy about these developments. If you just look on Twitter, you can see all of the influencers, the people that supported Trump. This bizarre interview with Senator Ted Cruz on Tucker's show, just amazing, bizarre. And I know you will probably touch on that. But Steve Bannon, Tim Pool, Tucker Carlson, many of Trump's strongest supporters are actively pushing that this is a mistake, and it is a mistake. I mean, it's hard to believe that in 2025, in the second Trump presidency, all of the Never Trumpers who signed that infamous piece in National Review when he first ran for president are convincing Trump to go to war in Iran. And on TV is John Bolton with his big smiley face, and Lindsey Graham never saw a war he didn't like, and he's like going along with them. It's insane. I don't get it. And weapons of mass destruction. I mean, where's Colin Powell? Let's have him go to the UN with another vial. I'm surprised they haven't rolled out Dick Cheney. Like 2002 called and wants his war back. Like what are we doing? It's crazy.
It really is. And just sticking on the lines of Trump and let's say the promises that he laid out in his campaign, considering, taking the big, beautiful bill and its, unprecedented level. I think it's, the third highest level of deficit spending ever taken on, like directly against the promise to try and bring down deficits and bring down government spending. And then, as you mentioned, this escalation of all of the wars that we had before his presidency, never mind this one as well. Do you think that, this is starting to really fracture the MAGA base and, these people are going to start feeling betrayed? And do you think we'll ultimately see Trump as a failed president?
I mean, he's risking it. Time will tell. I mean, there's the very small possibility that this is all an elaborate negotiating tactic. I actually don't think it is. I think Trump overestimates the power that he personally holds over his base and underestimates how much his base hates war. Mm-hmm. The American public has been lied to so relentlessly for so many decades. Since World War II, the U.S. has had an unbroken string of disastrous adventures. Even the Korean War was a dirty stalemate. Vietnam War lost. Iraq, Afghanistan. Like, find the last war we won, and Grenada doesn't count. And so I just don't get it. By the way, like, this footage of Netanyahu claiming that Iran is weeks away from a bomb going all the way back to 1992 is pretty devastating. Like, yeah. And then to follow it up with this Tucker interview with Cruz, who clearly is not a dumb guy, so he must be a very lazy guy, because he just doesn't know the first thing about Iran, and yet is like advocating that the U.S. should go to war with it. Iran is not Gaza. Iran is not Syria. Iran is a critical ally of both Russia and China, who we presume will take extensive measures to prop up that regime, ensure it survives, and to rope the U.S. and Israel into a war of attrition that it can't win. And, so then is the U.S. just going to escalate to nukes? Is that a win? Like, is that a good outcome? Like, if you're China, this is an amazing development for China. Super happy with this. Take an expended, tired U.S. military industrial complex that relies on China for a lot of things, by the way, and have it punch itself out of the Middle East and knock back the time that the U.S. could ever possibly be prepared, if it ever could, to face down China over Taiwan. Russia, the same thing. By the way, biggest loser of last week is Zelensky in Ukraine. Like, if there's limited air defense systems to go around, the constant barrage of 20 to 30 missiles a day that seem to be at least partially getting through the Iron Dome and David's Arrow or whatever, all of their various, missile defense systems in Israel, is going to require, a bit of refilling. And there's only so many of them to go around. Mm-hmm. Like, the reason you don't start wars is because it's hard to get out of them. And so, it's just amazing. And of course, we were wrong. Like, we just assumed that this would not happen, but here we are.
Well, was Zelensky really let's say, the biggest loser from the last week? I mean, Canada committed another $4 billion to Ukraine at the G7. So,
please. Canada could commit as much as it wants. If the U.S. is distracted from Ukraine, Ukraine is in big trouble. Mm-hmm. And by the way, that $4 billion is probably going to pay government salaries and just to keep the economy afloat. They've defaulted on their debt. They're a bankrupt country. Ukraine is a huge victim of Western adventurism, and it's a real tragedy. People should be held to account for what happened there. I doubt they will be. No country has suffered more than the young people of Ukraine who have been dying on the battlefields in this war. And again, with the U.S. now on to the next one, I think there's going to be some very bitter, justifiably bitter feelings in Ukraine. And Russia's like in the catbird seat now.
Well, it seems that because of those bitter feelings, that could possibly, spark or be a catalyst to Zelensky doing, maybe even more, considering
blowback, 100%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to try and regain the type of, let's say, spoiled child attention that he seems to.
Well, I mean, when you're desperate and backed into a corner and your risk is as existential, there's no limits. They might turn on the U.S. and Western interests. They might embark upon terrorism all across Russia in a way that provokes a real declaration of war by Russia. By the way, it's not a declaration of war. For all of the talk in the media, Russia could be doing much more. Just to give you a milestone. We'll know that the war is really serious when Russia takes out the 17 bridges across the Dnieper and isolates all of the Ukrainian troops, east of it, and insulates them from resupply. And then they'll just take all of that part of Ukraine, which is half of Ukraine. They're not doing that right now. But based on Putin observing the Iranians and the Americans were supposed to meet on Sunday for negotiations, and Israel assassinated the lead negotiator the Friday before. Can we talk about that? Is that wise? What does that mean for Trump's ability to negotiate with anybody? What do the Chinese see when they observe that behavior? What do the Russians see? What do the North Koreans see? So this is the second major phase of World War III. It wasn't sold that way to the Western populations, but that's what it is. And the precedent that is being set is even just Trump posting to Truth Social that he and he alone is considering whether to kill the head of state of another country. What are we doing? I honestly don't get it, Tom. And look, there will be people listening to this who think both of us are way out of line. I don't know. People need to think beyond the initial consequences of their behavior and ponder second, third, and fourth order consequences. And very, very few people are doing that, at the beginning of a war.
Which I mean is fair. If you or I had family members or friends that were killed in the initial attacks, I completely understand that, and I have all the sympathy in the world for that. But it doesn't help to analyze these situations by being completely emotional and just reacting to them. As you say, the second and third, fourth order consequences here are far bigger and far more consequential and important to consider, because something that I did want to get your thoughts on is if, as you put, if Trump decides, okay, we're going to actually use a nuclear weapon on Iran, what do you think that sets as a precedent for, considering that these types of weapons haven't been used for decades? And, we have these tensions not only between Iran and Israel, but the bigger allies that have a lot more firepower behind them. What sort of precedent does that set in the world today?
It's a terrible precedent. Even the contemplation of it is a terrible precedent. The whole point of nuclear weapons is mutually assured destruction, a threat that you never have to make. Like once you go down that road, there's a lot of bad outcomes. And by the way, let's take this logic further. Let's assume that the U.S. does a daring mission with bunker busting bombs and takes out the alleged enrichment facility. And I only use alleged because we're not sure that it's singular. I'm sure there's many of them, but it has become the focus. That's not the end of a short war, Tom. That's the beginning of a long one, right? Like, okay, we've taken out the U.S. and Israel has taken out what it believes to be a big chunk of Iranian enrichment. Okay, does that slow proliferation or accelerate it? Does that cause Iran to double and triple down? Does that cause every rogue state pondering whether they should get their hands on a nuclear weapon to accelerate their efforts? Like, have people actually thought this through? Everybody knows how to make nuclear weapons. It's a choice to go do it. The technology's out there. Believe me, every intelligence agency of every rogue state worth its salt has stolen the blueprints for how to make a nuclear bomb. The whole point of international non-proliferation law and treaties was to behave within the confines of those laws so as to minimize the prospect for proliferation. Israel did not behave within the confines of those laws last week. I mean, they preemptively struck a regime that it doesn't like, that it's been trying to agitate to go to war for a very long time, using the same rhetoric that was used to attack Iraq decades ago, weeks away from a nuclear weapon. They're probably closer to a nuclear weapon now than they were a week ago, because undoubtedly they're like, okay, well, now we actually have to do this. It's not clear to me, especially after watching Ted Cruz, that the upper echelon of the sort of pro-war camp in Washington gives much thought at all to what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if you go back and watch that interview, it's incredible the amount of assumptions that are just taken for granted in that. And one of the first pieces that really struck me is he said, I think we should have somebody that runs Iran that is friends with America instead of actively trying to kill the president of America. And if we weren't so interventionist all over the world, like, I don't think that would be such a consideration that we would have to be making all the time.
So we're just going to pretend that the CIA did not install the Shah of Iran, who ruled with an iron fist over that country for decades, and that they might have a slightly different view of the U.S. than we have of ourselves. Like, the shocking part of that interview was just how little thought Senator Cruz, who should be embarrassed, and in a sane world would probably resign, because he was totally beclowned by Tucker Carlson. By the way, I did not get the sense in watching as much as the interview as I could tolerate, that Tucker was trying to lay traps for him. Mm-hmm. I think Tucker was just shocked at how ignorant Senator Cruz was. And that is the word to describe his performance. It was deeply ignorant. Mm-hmm. This is supposed to be like the best of American society, a senator from Texas. It's stunning. Scary, actually, is the word that I would use.
And I think this highlights the point that we were making earlier. It seemed very emotional. If I put myself in his shoes, I would take time and thought to consider my answers before just reacting as he did. I understand that it is a very sensitive time. It is a very sensitive topic, but as a head of state, as you're mentioning, you would think that your goal would be to be very accurate with your words.
He has staff, right? I mean, he has people who work for him that should have prepared him for this interview. I think Tucker was genuinely stunned at the interview. I mean, I don't know how much of it you managed to get through.
I did watch the whole thing. It is
wow.
It is very, testing in some parts. They do a lot of bickering. As an interviewer watching it, though, I was fascinated by Tucker's performance because he really tried to dig into the definitions of what Ted Cruz was actually talking about, to make particular clarifications, to hopefully arrive at a solid understanding of what he's actually saying. And I think he also did a great job of standing up for himself without losing the plot.
Oh, Tucker, don't underestimate Tucker Carlson as an interviewer. Mm-hmm. We don't agree with everything that Tucker puts out, but he is, as analysts, he's somebody that we have to follow because he, for example, when he interviewed Putin, we of course watched that. And to get an interview with Putin is quite the get, as we like to say in the industry. But he is also clearly intelligent and did his homework and is quick on his feet. And I think was in shock, like partway through the interview. I think he was in shock as to what was unfolding in front of him. But as you say, didn't lose the plot, stuck to it. And it was pretty remarkable to watch. I praise you for getting all the way through it. At some point, I just had to turn it off and then just watched a few highlights just so I knew, what I missed. Because it's just uncomfortable. Like Cruz was not only disingenuous, but just, it's very clear his entire tone and his body language was very dismissive. Not used to being on the other end of such sort of prosecutions, I guess is the best way I could describe it. But yeah, that was a masterclass by Tucker Carlson. Whatever your views on Tucker Carlson, I would not underestimate him as an interviewer. And as you know, as a professional interviewer yourself, there's significant skill required to pull that off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why I said, as an interviewer, I was impressed by it. But I kind of, get the sense that, at least in the West, it seems like we are more and more, let's say, tied to these types of individuals that are very emotional in their analysis, in their thinking, than maybe the East is. Is that the wrong way to think about it?
I wish I understood the intellectual basis behind the wing of politicians in DC who never saw a war they didn't like or didn't agitate for. Again, like, name the last war that the West has won, and Grenada doesn't count. I can't think of one. Maybe militarily we defeated Iraq, but did the U.S. really win the peace there? All the money and blood spent on Afghanistan just to have the Taliban back in charge? All of the years of mucking around in Syria just to have a former ISIS member now in charge? What's the point of all of this? I mean, the point seems to be, when you're in the bomb-making business, peace is a working capital problem. It's right out of Orwell. It really is. Like, again, to see John Bolton on CNN happy about this development, and Lindsey Graham calling for boots on the ground and direct U.S. involvement. Like, these are really old tapes, Tom. Weeks away. Iran has been weeks away from a nuclear bomb since the 1990s. It's just incredible to watch. And look, Benjamin Netanyahu went all in, bet the country on this adventure. That's a serious decision to make. He made it, and now we will see the consequences. I genuinely hope for peace. I hope that there's a diplomatic solution. Who knows? Russia mediates, takes away their enriched uranium, agrees to supply Iran with an infinite supply of, 3.5% uranium to run its nuclear reactors, and kumbaya, everybody shakes hands, and everybody walks back from the ledge. That doesn't seem very possible right now. But I would be more than happy. We would be more than happy to see that happen. I'm sure you would too. There's no winning this war. There's only losing wars. It's the degree to which both sides will lose is all that remains to be determined.
What do you make as well of, let's say, Trump's criticism of Tulsi Gabbard's testimony that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons? Like, why go against your director of national intelligence that you're supposed to be relying on for that type of information?
There comes a point where she would have to resign, you would think. Now, to be fair to Trump, he is the most accessible president in memory, and he's always talking to the media. And he always has sort of a witty back and forth with the media, and sometimes says things that he doesn't quite mean, or sometimes says things just to put people on their back foot. And who knows whether this response to a question was truly meant to come across in the way that it did. So I maybe give him a bit of a pass and give Tulsi Gabbard a bit of a pass on that. Mm-hmm. I think the administration is as split as the president's base on this issue. I think J.D. Vance probably doesn't want to go to war. Many of the president's earliest and most loyal supporters think this is a disaster. I think they're right. Could be wrong. But if Trump does press go this weekend, as Seymour Hersh predicted yesterday in a bit of an eyebrow-raising piece.
Is that this is the Samson option?
No, if Trump presses go and directly gets involved and begins bombing Iran and gets the U.S. ensnared in another forever war, as Seymour Hersh wrote yesterday, it was going to happen this weekend after the stock market closed because Trump didn't want to impact, the stock market. If Seymour Hersh's reporting is right and Trump's 2-week window is just another sort of deception, he's betting his presidency. Mm-hmm. I mean, he just is. And I think he will have betrayed many of his voters. And again, I'm not advocating, I'm just trying to analyze. And when I talk to the Trump voters that I know, this was not what they signed up for. Another adventure in the Middle East over weapons of mass destruction in 2025. Mm-hmm.
So, there's been such a constant flood of news and just constantly conflicting information. And we live in a time where we have more access to media than has ever been possible before. But I don't think it's ever been more difficult to actually get a grasp of what is actually happening. So how do you think about, let's say, separating the wheat from the chaff and trying to get a grasp on what is actually happening?
Yeah, this is where Twitter is the most amazing tool and the most frustrating tool, mm-hmm. Especially in the era of AI. And we laid all this out in what we thought was a pretty thoughtful piece, Fog Lights, mm-hmm. where we described why we thought it wasn't going to happen and that we were wrong, and here's why we think we were wrong, and here's what that means. Separating signal from noise on social media is very challenging, especially if you have a strong emotional attachment to either side. So mm-hmm. I understand why somebody who lives in Israel or somebody who has relatives from Israel is going to read social media a different way than people who are closely tied to the Palestinian situation, for example. But for those of us who don't have such direct ties, the challenge as an analyst and not an advocate is to do your best to separate that signal from the noise. So as a general rule, video evidence is more powerful than just written evidence. So when we see claims that, 60 missiles were launched from Iran into Israel, written as text, maybe. Coming from the Iranian pro news website, maybe. But when you see videos and you're pretty sure they're not AI, because we're still at the point where AI is relatively easy to detect, mm-hmm. That's more definitive for us. And then when we see the same strike from multiple vantage points, then we're pretty certain that a strike occurred at that place. And if we're seeing some strikes, then there's probably a lot more strikes. And again, a week into this is supposed to have been over by now. I do believe that Israel assumed with its what now apparently has been a cyber attack to start the war that shut down all of Iran's anti-air defense systems for about 8 to 10 hours, allegedly. And the decapitation strikes and the drone attacks that sort of marked the beginning of this war, or this phase of World War III, if you like. They assumed that they would have an early knockout blow. And if you don't score that knockout blow against a country that has 10 times your population and the full backing of Russia and China, it's hard to see how Israel wins a war of attrition. And every day that we see missiles landing in Israel is proof that perhaps Netanyahu and his government underestimated what exactly they were getting involved in.
So let's go back to that piece that you guys wrote in October, really highlighting the vulnerabilities, as you saw it, of Israel. What were and what are those vulnerabilities that Israel has that kind of put you in a place where you didn't see that this was a likely situation to escalate to this point?
Sure. So on October 1st, 2024, Iran launched a barrage of missiles as a response to an attack by Israel. And we watched in some, in mild shock, several of these missiles both getting through the Israeli missile defense system and hitting targets with some precision. And we thought that was a game changer. And no less a source than the Washington Post admitted as much a few days later. They talked about how an Israeli air base was hit with precision strikes and did some damage. And as a demonstration, sort of as an axiom, we came to the conclusion that because of Israel's relatively small size geographically, it was now in a position of mutually assured destruction. Of course, the Samson option for Israel, but you don't really need a nuclear weapon to make Israel unlivable. And we went on to talk about in that piece, again, which was titled October Surprise, that almost all of Israel's electricity is produced at just 5 power plants. More than half of its drinking water is produced by 5 desalination plants. All of its natural gas comes from 2 fields. Most of its gasoline and diesel comes from a refinery in Haifa, which has been attacked now. If Iran is in possession of hypersonic missiles that Israel's air defense system cannot take down, or cannot take down in total, if Iran has an ample stockpile of such missiles, it would seem that it would be unwise to go to war with Iran, because with just a dozen targets, Iran could make Israel unlivable. And so in a mutually assured destruction situation, a weird détente or peace breaks out because neither side wants to be to go down that road. And Netanyahu clearly decided to go down that road. And so when we look at our axioms that we laid out in October Surprise, Israel's air defense system is not nearly as impenetrable as once thought. Iran is probably sitting on a bunch of missiles. Israeli leaders understand their strategic vulnerabilities and will behave accordingly. Clearly, Netanyahu and the military planners in Israel thought they could deal the knockout blow to eliminate that threat basically on the first day. And here we are a week later, and missiles are still raining down into Israel. And you can bet, you should assume, especially China, are going to backstop Iran. And the US clearly is going to backstop Israel. But we've seen that the combination of Russia and China has defeated NATO in Ukraine. Why would it be any different in the Middle East? So it kind of, we put it out there. It was a controversial piece at the time, by the way, and we're not afraid of controversy, and we show our homework. Like, our view is authentically held, politely expressed views where the homework is shown should never make somebody angry. We're not afraid to be wrong, but people get very angry about this particular situation. And so there's not much that can be done about that. We lost a few subscribers when we published this piece earlier this week. Hopefully we gained more than we lost, such is the nature of the business. But if we did lose subscribers by authentically expressing our views politely and showing our homework, there's not much we can do about it. Take your business elsewhere.
Well, there is certainly always a risk that anything that any of us put out as content creators, you can't make everybody happy. And ideally, I think the way that you put that is perfect. Trying to be polite about expressing a situation that you have done your homework on, shown it, and politely presented it, I think is the best way to go forward.
And following up when you're wrong. Like we could
totally.
We could have just ignored that piece we wrote in October and just chronicled the war. But no, like we would much rather have long-term subscribers who know us and believe that when we press send, what we're saying is 100% what we believe to be true in the moment. New data might come in. We may have gotten things wrong. Mistakes should be rare, admitted to, corrected, and learned from. And we always try to do that. We routinely write pieces where we grade ourselves on prior predictions. We have a pretty good track record, not perfect. If we were perfect, we wouldn't be making bold enough calls. And so hopefully some of the subscribers who got annoyed with that piece will eventually work their way back. But if they don't, that's fine. We have an expression around here, which is going to sound odd, but all of our subscribers are precious, but none particularly so. We write for ourselves, and we will let the market decide the value of our work, and we will accept the market's decision. We're not captured by the disease of more. Like, if we wanted to write for clicks and to optimize subscribers, I know how to do that. It's not intellectually very stimulating, nor is it fun. Nor is it, something that I personally want to do. But I could start 2 Substacks tomorrow: Red Meat for liberals and Red Meat for conservatives, and both would be wildly successful, and we would make more money than Doomberg makes. Like, it's not about that. It's about, my children read Doomberg, my friends and family read Doomberg. I want a track record of how we behaved, how we wrote, what we said, how we responded to comments, how we responded to negative feedback. That's far more important to us, and I think that comes through for our most loyal and long-term subscribers.
Well, as you've put it in your work before, this is your life's work, right?
100%.
That's something that you want to be proud of.
I don't want to write red meat for conservatives, but it could be done. Like, you see engagement harvesting on Twitter. I'm skilled in the art of social media now, having done this for several years, just like you. Then you have to decide what it is you're willing to do and behave accordingly.
So let's go back. For those that might not understand it, what is the Samson option, Doomberg?
Yeah, well, this is the undeclared, widely held belief that Israel is in possession of a number of nuclear weapons and would be prepared to use them. Again, in violation of proliferation laws and all that other stuff. But Israel gets an exception in this regard for a variety of reasons. And so Samson option is the ultimate deterrent that Israel is in possession of. And so, Iran has to be careful too. But we are as close to an exchange of nuclear weapons in the world since World War II at the moment. You have people in the White House leaking to the press that the president is actually considering tactical nuclear weapons in Iran, in a war, by the way, that is undeclared, that Congress hasn't declared. One would imagine that whatever legal basis for the war on terror probably does not stretch to the point where the president is authorized to preemptively use nuclear weapons against a country that, at least in the past week, has not attacked any U.S. assets. But we shall see. The rules are meaningless now. Like, we're in a totally uncharted territory, and just the fact that rules are meaningless has not really been thought through.
One of the other things that I think is, or could be, highly consequential, and I mean, again, I've seen reports that it is closed, it isn't closed, it's back and forth, up and down, is the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. What effect would that have? What downstream effects would that have on, let's just say, energy prices alone?
It's almost impossible to model. We've spent a lot of time thinking about it. So one of the things, well, let me take a step back. When we are confronted with such questions, we often ask ourselves, what are the milestones for us to be looking at in the market to determine the probability of that event? And we have an unusual one to propose to you. Everybody thinks there's a price of oil, but there isn't a price of oil. There's the price of many grades of oil. The two most famous ones are WTI and Brent crude. WTI, West Texas Intermediate, is basically the price of U.S. oil. And Brent crude is the price of international oil. There are other international grades. There's other North American grades, Canadian, Western Canada, WCS, Western Canadian Select. One of the things that we would look for if the market were truly predicting, catastrophe, would be a significant divergence between WTI and Brent, because we don't doubt for a second that Trump would impose export bans, both on crude oil and refined goods, in order to ensure that U.S. consumers were insulated from the brunt of whatever happened overseas. And that would drive a wide disparity between contracts that today trade in lockstep with each other. We're not seeing that yet. Another thing that we're looking at is the price of landed LNG in Europe. versus that of Brent crude because they tend to trade in lockstep corrected for energy. So if you take LNG prices in Europe and multiply them by 5.6, you get the barrel of oil equivalent price of liquefied natural gas. And today, Brent and that contract are trading in lockstep. They're not diverging. Why does that matter? Well, 20% of global LNG supply comes from Qatar, and they're on the wrong side of that strait. And just the threat of closing it might cause insurance providers to refuse to underwrite voyages through that strait. If the world loses 20% of the total global production of oil and 20% of LNG because that strait is closed, you're in a very different world that is almost impossible to model, right? And so it's you would see very, very radical things. Like during the last energy crisis, what we saw, for example, was coking coal traded cheaper than thermal coal, which had never happened before. Well, that just tells you markets are really screwed up. We saw wildly different prices for LNG versus Brent crude. Just to give you, let's put some numbers. So the region of the world that would suffer the most is the European Union, by far. So the European Union each year consumes 40 exajoules of oil, natural gas, and coal. They only produce 6. So that means they rely on imports for 34 exajoules, which is roughly the entire US natural gas production. In a world where that strait is closed, suddenly the importance of being back integrated to energy would be wildly important. And the two biggest, strongest players in that regard are the US and Russia. So the US and Russia can impose export controls to ensure that their populations and their military industrial complexes are insulated from it. China's in trouble in that scenario, somewhat, although it probably can be backfilled to a degree from Russia. And so it depends if Israel just takes out Iran's refining and crude exporting capacity. That's a big deal, but not as big a deal as closing the strait in its entirety. There's no making up for 20 million barrels a day. And so the biggest region of the world that is in the most trouble in that scenario is Europe, followed probably by China. Which, by the way, is why China's going to do everything it can to help Iran.
Right. Yeah, to help things keep flowing.
Yeah.
So on top of that, Doomberg, the markets this week did not react the way I think many people would have expected them to, considering another escalation of a conflict here. What do you think? What do you make of the market's reaction to this? And do you think it has anything to do with this massive triple witching options expiry as well today?
So the short answer is I don't understand it, but I doubt it's triple witching options expiration. Because it's not just the oil market. Gold is not pricing World War III, and neither are stocks. So the market has concluded that there's an off-ramp here that you and I don't see. Now, there is significant geopolitical risk premium embedded into oil. Like our equilibrium price of oil in a well-supplied world without the prospect of World War III is $55 a barrel. So oil trading at 75, $20 risk premium, or what's that? 35% risk premium is pretty substantial. And that's probably option adjusted that it goes to 130 if the strait is closed, and it drops to 55 if there's peace. And so it's probably fairly priced. But the gold markets and the stock markets are not trading like that. And by the way, we arrive at that $55 equilibrium price because $10 LNG is sort of everybody in the LNG market earns their cost of capital, and you multiply that by 5.6 and you get $56 a barrel oil, and that's kind of our equilibrium price. LNG today in Europe, as we're talking, let me just pull it up. It's trading at $14 a million BTU. So there's, again, a 35-40% price premium over the equilibrium price of LNG as well. So there's significant risk premium priced into the energy markets. Of course, stocks and gold are secondarily impacted, and so perhaps that makes sense. That energy would be pricing more risk in. But if you would have told me Thursday of last week what has transpired in the following 7 days, and then set the over-under at the price of oil of 75, I would have taken the way over. So I don't know. And when I don't know, I don't like to pretend like I do.
Well, I think that's a very fair answer, because I haven't read anything that truly explains it, other than clearly we're missing something.
Well, there is the one little relatively inconvenient fact of Trump. We now probably have an answer as to why OPEC mysteriously and aggressively started to increase its production targets after Trump visited the Middle East, because it's probably proof that this was a plan well hatched by then, that Trump was well aware of and frankly signed off on. Former Senator and now Secretary of State Marco Rubio's initial denials notwithstanding. I think that actually is pretty damning for Trump on the international stage, and risky for Iran's neighbors, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman. If Trump's visit to the Middle East, where he gave that speech bemoaning regime change wars, which is just really remarkable, if the decision had already been made by then and Trump was prodding OPEC to increase production to get ahead of it, sort of James Baker style before the first Gulf War, that conveys to people paying attention a certain amount of duplicity on the part of Trump that might be difficult to come back from in international relations.
What other hotspots should we be considering right now? You guys wrote a piece on the risk of Estonia right now, or possibly Taiwan. Like, are there other pieces that we should be kind of keeping an eye on, not just what's big and loud and shiny right now?
I think, don't we have enough hotspots to worry about at this point? Look, I think Estonia and Europe they're going to have a slightly different stance towards Russia in this new environment, because the U.S. is going to be distracted and will prioritize Israel over Ukraine. I think Zelensky is the biggest, outside of the immediate combatants, the biggest sort of secondary loser of the past week. We're already seeing a significant uptick in Russian aerial assaults over Ukraine, and continued sort of attrition war along the entire battlefronts. I don't think Taiwan is like China. That's just not very Chinese to do that, to take Taiwan now just because it's opportunistic. I think China plays a much longer time horizon and will be more than happy is the wrong way to say it, but they will not be totally unpleased to see the U.S. have to punch itself out in the Middle East, and will be doing whatever it can behind the scenes without getting directly involved necessarily, to keep a war of attrition in the Middle East going, because China is the second biggest beneficiary of such an outcome. Because then, truly, if the U.S. is distracted and tied down on two fronts that don't involve Taiwan, then what's the point of China moving on Taiwan? It can just wait and continue to build up its own, missile systems and military and industrial base and so on, while the U.S., exerts itself in other areas.
One of the last things I'd like to ask if you have considered, I've seen different reports of this, and of course, if we consider the incentives, I think the risk of this is, let's say rising, but that's the risk of false flag attacks to catalyze some type of action based on people not, let's say, necessarily getting what they want at this point. So
forget false flags, real flags. There's anywhere between 10 and 20 million people crossed over the border illegally during the Biden administration, many of whom were military-aged men with no record of documentation of where they are and what they're doing. You don't think there's Chinese and Iranian sleeper cells in part of that? So let's just take these two drone attacks, very similar, against the Iranian, missile defense systems and the Russian strategic nuclear bombers. You don't think China can do that in the U.S.? We're porous here. Ports, container ships, open borders. The U.S. is buying up land all around China is buying up land all around U.S. military bases, like cyber attacks. I was just on a driving trip through, your part of the country, drove through Ontario, and you see mile after mile of giant transmission lines taking, nuclear power to various places. And you drive through Quebec and you see all of Hydro-Quebec's transmission lines into New York. Like, none of those are guarded. They're right there. Forget about false flags. Like, real flag attacks are totally possible. And again, one of the things that drives us crazy is when you hear Lindsey Graham on TV, he just assumes nobody ever punches back. Mm-hmm. Like, if you're going to push a country like Iran to an existential war, they're unlikely to behave in ways that are totally predictable. Same with Ukraine. Wars are really hard to lose. Ukraine might embark upon a major terrorist campaign inside of Russia to try to provoke Russia even further. And who knows what happens after that. The Turk Stream natural gas pipeline between Russia and Turkey that feeds the underbelly of Europe. Ukraine has tried to destroy that pipeline multiple times, allegedly. What if they succeed? We're heading into another winter here soon. Just once you start down this path, it's kind of hard to put the genie back in the bottle. Layer on top of that false flag attacks, of course, but it's very clear that Trump feels like he needs no provocation to go to war. He can just decide to go to war. And maybe he'll decide that this weekend.
Well, there's certainly so much to pay attention to consider. Doomberg, I always appreciate your thoughtful analysis on these subjects. I hope people can take a deep breath and listen to this unemotionally and just consider all of the forces at play and, hopefully come away more informed.
Yeah, Tom, look, I always smile when you send us an email asking us on, because I know it's going to be a great discussion, and you do have a fantastic audience who generally gets it. And so hopefully most people understand that the two of us are just trying to make sense of a very complicated world authentically and politely and showing our homework. And those are the three of our brand ambitions that we stay true to, no matter how annoyed some people might get with our work, and we don't ever plan to deviate from it.
Mm-hmm. Well, keep doing what you do. You guys do an excellent job. Of course, that's all available at doomberg.substack.com. Doomberg, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Tom.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.